Hi everyone, my name is Melissa van Dijk, and in today's video I want to show you where modern acne advice actually comes from. Because if you go to a dermatologist today, you will usually hear the same explanation. Acne is a chronic inflammatory skin condition influenced by hormones, oil production, bacteria, genetics and immune responses, with diet potentially affecting acne more strongly in some people. Now, if you have been following my channel closely, you know that I have been tracking this myself for the last couple of years, basically every single day. And because my acne was moderate to severe, I had enough flare-ups, enough data, and enough repeated patterns to realize very quickly that this was not random. Everything kept pointing back to food, inflammation, water retention, and the overall environment inside the body. So eventually I started asking myself, okay, where exactly is this confidence coming from? Like, what are the actual studies behind these claims? And honestly, once I started digging into the research, things got very strange very quickly. Because what I expected to find was this huge body of strong evidence clearly providing that diet and internal factors were mostly irrelevant to acne. But that's not what I found at all. What I found was a couple of very small studies from the late 1960s and early 1970s that somehow turned into decades of extremely confident medical advice about what does and does not matter for acne. And once you actually go back and read those studies yourself, the logic starts falling apart surprisingly fast, because a lot of the conclusions became much bigger than what the studies were actually capable of providing. Now, let's start with probably the most famous example, the chocolate study from 1969 by Dr. James Fulton. This is one of the main reasons people have been told for decades that chocolate does not cause acne and that diet is mostly irrelevant. They took 65 people and split them into two groups. One group received a chocolate bar and the other group received a control bar. And because the acne outcomes were similar, the conclusion slowly became chocolate does not cause acne. And eventually even broader, diet probably does not matter much either. But when you actually look at the study more closely, the logic completely falls apart. Because the control bar was not some healthy neutral food, it was still full of sugar and vegetable fat. So they were not really testing chocolate versus no chocolate. They were testing one processed sugary fatty bar against another processed sugary fatty bar. And that is a huge difference. Because if both bars affect insulin, inflammation, or the internal environment of the body in similar ways, then the null result does not provide diet is irrelevant. It may simply mean both groups were consuming foods that could potentially worsen acne. That is a completely different conclusion. But instead of the medical community saying maybe both products were problematic, the message slowly became chocolate is a myth. And then eventually diet is mostly irrelevant to acne. So this very narrow experiment slowly turned into a massive conclusion. And this is where things start becoming very strange to me, because once that idea entered textbooks, dermatology culture, and mainstream medical advice, people stopped asking harder questions. The original evidence was barely questioned anymore. The conclusion just became accepted. And over time, the confidence became stronger and stronger, even though the actual foundation was still very weak. But there was still another problem that the follicle-only model never really explained properly: water retention, digestive changes, and premenstrual acne. Because as women, many of us experience the exact same chain of events before our period. The body starts retaining more water, the face looks puffier, digestion changes, inflammation increases, the skin becomes more reactive, and then the breakouts appear. And after tracking this myself for years, it stopped looking random to me. So logically, you would expect this to become a major research topic. you would expect researchers to ask what actually happens to the follicle when tissue becomes swollen, when fluid pressure changes, when digestion slows down, when inflammation increases, or when the body is retaining more water overall. Does sodium matter? Does swelling around the follicle matter? Does the internal environment of the skin change before a breakout even appears? But when you actually go looking for serious research, directly testing water retention and acne, there's almost nothing there. There's essentially one small study from 1972 involving just 21 patients. They tested a diuretic, basically a water pill, to see if reducing water retention would improve premenstrual acne. It didn't show a clear benefit, and somehow that became enough for the entire topic to basically disappear. But think about that logic carefully. This one medication did not work in one tiny study, therefore fluid retention is irrelevant to acne. This is a massive logical leap, because testing one specific intervention is not the same thing as disproving an entire biological process, especially when the study is tiny, narrow, and over 50 years old. And honestly, this is the pattern I keep seeing throughout acne research. Weak evidence becomes very strong conclusions, and then those conclusions become common knowledge. Now, this is where people usually respond with something like, well, Melissa, there's no modern evidence showing that water retention or sodium causes acne. And technically, they're right. But the important question is, why is there no evidence? Is it because the link truly does not exist? Or is it because these old studies were treated as good enough, so nobody seriously followed the question afterward? Because those are completely different explanations. And I think this is one of the biggest problems in medicine generally. We confuse a lack of research with proof that something is false. We mistake a lack of interest for a lack of a connection. And with acne, I think that happened repeatedly. The chocolate study was too narrow. The conclusions about diet became too broad. The water retention research was barely followed up. And yet, somehow, all of this turned into decades of extremely confident advice. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than just chocolate or water retention. Because once acne became framed mainly as a follicle disease, oil, bacteria, clogged pores, inflammation, the entire treatment model changed. Now, the focus was no longer what is creating the internal environment for the breakout, but the focus became how do we manage the follicle itself. And economically, that changes everything, because if acne is mainly environmental, dietary, inflammatory, or connected to the internal state of the body, then the solution becomes much less product dependent. It becomes about changing the environment, changing food quality, reducing inflammatory triggers, and looking at sodium, insulin, water retention, stress, hormones, sleep, and tissue inflammation together. That is a very different model. But if acne is framed mainly as a localized follicle disorder, then the solution becomes products, creams, antibiotics, Accutane, benzoyl peroxide, acids, treatments, procedures, long-term symptom management. And once the medical community accepted the idea that diet and internal factors were mostly myths, the industry naturally grew around managing the symptom instead of investigating the environment creating it. And honestly, when you step back and look at the timeline, it is hard not to notice how perfectly those things lined up. Weak studies, massive conclusions, research directions disappearing, and then an enormous product industry growing around the replacement model. And the really strange part is that all of this confidence was built on studies that were tiny, narrow, and often logically flawed. And that is where the logic behind the modern acne model starts breaking down. So when people say certain acne myths were debunked, I think we really need to ask, debunked by what exactly? strong evidence, large repeated studies, or a handful of weak papers from the late 1960s and early 1970s that slowly became accepted as truth? Because honestly, once you actually go back and look at the research yourself, the confidence does not match the quality of the evidence. And I think that is a serious problem. Now, I would love to know what you think about this. Do you think acne research dismissed internal factors too quickly? Have you noticed patterns with diet, water retention, sodium, digestion, or your cycle that the standard acne model does not explain very well? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!